Welcome to Spinning Back Clique, the MMA Junkie weekly roundtable show where we discuss the latest news and notes in the world of mixed martial arts. It is April 17th, and I am your host, Mike Bond, coming to you from Toronto, joined this week on the panel by George and Goes from MMA Junkie Radio, who are both in Las Vegas. And then, of course, MMA Junkie fight analyst Dan Tom, also coming to us from Las Vegas. We kind of teaming up on me this week, guys, with the Las Vegas trio here, but wouldn't have it any other way. Let's get right into it, shall we? Another busy week, lots of stuff to discuss, and let's go right into topic one. UFC Kansas City goes down on Saturday night. Max Holloway held serve in the main event as the top featherweight contender, defeating Arnold Allen by unanimous decision. It continues to seem like when we talk about featherweight, it is Max Holloway, Alexander Volkanovski, and then everyone else when it comes to the hierarchy at 145 pounds. But guys, we know the deal. Holloway is 0-3 in head-to-head fights against Volkanovski, and unless the champ loses the belt, it's hard to envision Holloway getting another title shot or setting up that fourth fight. So I ask you guys, if you are Holloway, his new manager, Tim Simpson from Chosen Advisory, UFC matchmaker, Sean Shelby, UFC executive, Hunter Campbell, how do you manage Holloway's career going forward in a way that makes sense for him, for the division, all that kind of stuff? Goes, I want to go to you first.
Well, I think a lot of us were waiting for Max to have that one fight where he just starts to slow down, and he didn't really have that. He's proved that he's still top notch. So I think if I'm his manager, I got to ask him what he wants out of life at this point, right? Are you here to cash checks? If you are, the Korean Zombie's right there. That's a layup. You could take that fight. It's not like Mike said, it's the top two guys and everyone else. I don't know that that's going to challenge him so much. But if he's still hungry, if I'm Max, I go that John Jones route. I start to put some muscle on my frame. I take a little bit of time off, not John Jones time off. Don't go away that long. Take a little bit of time out and really fill into a 155 body. Because when you look at the champion, all right, I think he's 5'10". Max is 5'11". They're very, very close in reach, almost identical. You see Alexander Volkanovski, he went up and he's smaller and he gave the champ hell. All right. Now, I know Max has done this in the past, but he didn't really do it with the intentions of staying there. Right. I think if he really dedicates his body towards that 155 frame, I think he'll have some pretty good matchups to deal with. I think he'll have a new hunger for trying to maybe get that title, which is funny because you never know the way things go. He might be chasing Alexander Volkanovski again, just at another weight class. But if he stays at 145, there's just not much for him. I don't know that it really interests a guy like Max Holloway, a future Hall of Famer. So I would roll the dice and maybe try and go up in weight.
Yeah, that's a potential option. And before I ask you, Dan, about maybe if he stays at 45, I want to go off that. Holloway at 55, we have seen it obviously against Poirier, but that was very short notice. He got 3 months notice for that fight. They were trying to do Tony Ferguson in that place, and then, it didn't come together. So they went to Max against Poirier. Do you feel like he would be, if he took maybe 8 months, 10 months, a year off to build up his body? He seemed a little bigger in this fight than usual, but could he be a factor at 155? The thing that worries me is the power, right? We know that the volume is so effective, but can he go up there where he's a significant threat at 155 in terms of what his skill set can bring to the table?
Man, I'm a big Max Holloway fan, and you might be outnumbered, Mike, but like Max Holloway, I too am a Hawaiian that has love for Canada. Max, he's got love for a lot of things. He's got a big appetite, so going up in weight is in his future. He says so himself, but he does say that he wants to go up with a belt. I think it'd be better if he didn't. I think it'd be less pressure, more flexibility in matchups. But going by Max's own words, he says he doesn't want to move up there unless he has a belt. He's eyeing for a fight with Korean Zombie, which makes sense in the sense of he's in that stage of his career maybe where he's not necessarily challenging for a title since he's 0-2 to the champ. Throw him in the fun fights. Throw him against the veterans. The problem is there's not many veterans to throw him against because UFC seems to be cutting most of them. And even though you could justify Korean Zombie and Holloway from a rankings perspective, let's be honest, it feels like we're kind of just feeding, the zombie to the wood chipper. I don't hate the Tony Ferguson idea, moving up a division for fun fights. Maybe that'll kind of take that pressure off of the gold belt that Max puts on himself. They did try to make the Ferguson fight, I believe, even as early, correct me if I'm wrong, post UFC 200. Remember, it was supposed to be one of the many Khabib Fergusons, ended up being Ferguson Venata for Lando Venata's debut, but they actually tried to make a Holloway Ferguson back then. I will throw out one suggestion, and I'll stop it short because this fight may come up. But I say break apart Dariush and Oliveira because I'm one of the few people who hate that fight and will gladly say why later. But one of the reasons why you could pull it apart is because Max Holloway and Charles Oliveira could be run back. It's a perfect time for both of them. They haven't fought since UFC Saskatoon, speaking of Canada, in 2015. So I would love to see that fight.
Yeah, I was at that one in Saskatoon. The strange esophagus injury that was never really confirmed, and we don't actually know what happened. That was a very strange one. But yeah, we will get to Charles Oliveira and Dariush a little later. But George, I want to ask you, what do you think of this Max Holloway Korean zombie idea? Do you think this is a good fit for Holloway going forward? Coming off this, if you're his team, you're the UFC, do you look like as one that makes sense? I know if you see the reaction to it of Max's comments, and fair play to him, he didn't go out there, demanding this. He got asked a question by a media member saying he's wanted to fight you for a long time. And Holloway, you don't genuinely see him get like that excited when another fighter's name brought up. He's like, man, I want to fight this guy for such a long time. Like, it's more about, I feel like, the legacy stuff. And he's the only guy in the top 7, I think, he hasn't fought. But some of the fans seem to feel like this would almost be cruel matchmaking. Where do you sit on that line?
I feel like the fans do. It is leading a lamb to slaughter. Korean Zombie did not look great in his last fight, and I feel like he's just past his prime. I got excited about the matchup too because they're both OGs, so it's not like I'm not digging it. And maybe the UFC makes this thing happen because that would help the UFC out because there just seems to be a logjam. But look, the guys presented excellent cases, and I'm really digging Oliveira versus Holloway. Great job, Dan Tom. However, I also think there's another way to approach this. First, let's let the fight happen in July, where Yair fights Volkanovski. We may no longer have Volkanovski at the top of the division after that fight. I don't think that's the case, but it's a possibility. Anything can happen. Alexa Grasso, hello, right? But so many things can happen, man. Maybe Volkanovski wins and says sayonara to the featherweight division and just says, I'm now going to apply myself here. You guys battle it out down there. I mean, look at Alex Tejeda. He recently said, I'm moving up. I won the title. I'm 1-1 overall with Izzy. 3-1 if you want to count kickboxing. We can always revisit, but for now, my focus is here. Volkanovski could always return. Who knows? So I think time has shown us, and covering the sport has shown us, all of us have covered the sport at least a decade, that so many things can happen. And so to overthink it is too much. However, the one thing that a lot of fighters used to crap on in the past, and really they need to take a good look at, is look at those opportunities to become an interim champ, because it gets you to the front of the line. You don't have to be the backup or nothing like that. And guess what? Pay-per-view points. So like Goz was saying earlier, what drives you? What motivates you? The money, the belt. Let's start answering those questions and figuring things out. So no, I really don't want to see Zombie against Max. I just think Max is too good. It would really, I don't think it would be competitive at all. Sorry, TKZ. I love you. I had your original t-shirt back in the day. But yeah, I don't like that matchup at all. Just hang out, wait, see what happens in July, and then let's see how things play out. Now, look, there is a possibility that Volkanovski loses and says, I want to run it back. And he would get that instant equity because of all the title defenses he's had, and he's a constant defender of his title, so he'd probably get there. But what if he's not ready to go? Then maybe that's where Max slips in. Who knows? Remember, Jose Aldo didn't get a rematch against Conor as well. He got clipped. Maybe it's one of those situations. So many things can happen.
Yeah, I think you laid it out pretty well there. It is tricky though, right? I think the Korean Zombie fight, in a sense, would work because it's unlike this Arnold Allen situation where you're not killing off a guy who's a potential title-ready contender and a fresh name and all that stuff. So, and the UFC did try to do this fight before. I think it was briefly discussed when they were trying to have that South Korea event that ultimately ended up falling apart, and they did the road to the UFC finals in Las Vegas. So there is some history between these two. It's just, yeah, do you feel like it's the right move for Max? And a lot obviously depends, as you said, George, on the July title fight. If Volkanovski wins, does he go up and try to fully commit to that rematch with Makhachev and trying to pursue that. If he loses, do they give him an immediate rematch, which hurts Holloway's timeline and stuff too? So there's a lot going on here in terms of like how all the pieces come together. And I think it all depends on what happens in July during International Fight Week. But on the flip side of this coin, to kind of close out topic one here, Arnold Allen, he did lose this fight. He was 10-0 in the UFC coming in here. And obviously this was his big step up. This was his moment to guarantee his title shot, all that kind of stuff. Didn't get the win, but I think he performed valiantly in there against Max. Dan, Tom, what did you think of Arnold Allen's performance? How do you assess it in a losing effort?
Yeah, I think he did fine from what I saw going through the distance there. I just was happy that what I just said, we got to see him go through the distance. We never got to see Allen in a 5-round fight. He's only been scheduled for one, and that includes his entirety of his career, not just his UFC. So being able to get that, we had the unfortunate ending with the Calvin Kattar fight. But this, we got much more of Allen, even in multiple stances, because Max will switch stance. He did a lot of southpaw, which we haven't really gotten to see Allen in kind of southpaw versus southpaw matchup, which gets my brain thinking. But I think Allen should hold his head up high. Even Max said so himself. He said, "I wouldn't be surprised if we see each other again." I'm not sure about that with the way the timelines might shake out, but absolutely, Allen is a competitor in this division, and I hope he doesn't go down too far. I hope he kind of gets the rub even from a loss, so to speak.
Agreed. Yeah, I said in my post-fight matchmaker piece that I'd like to see Arnold Allen fight Brian Ortega next. I think that would be a very logical fight for the division. Goes, I saw your reaction there. What do you think of that fight?
Yeah, I like that, man. I mean, Allen proved that he deserves to be here, and he just happens to be around at a time where the top two dogs are future Hall of Famers. It's a bump in the road, but I expect them to make adjustments and make another push again. I mean, the dude, the way he was throwing power shots from odd angles. I mean, how often do we ever see Max Holloway really busted up like that? I thought Arnold Allen did about just as good as you can in a loss, and I hope to see him soon.
Agreed. Yeah, George, anything else to chime in before we move on?
He showed so much heart because he came out in the 5th round, and I mean, he was as dangerous as he was in the 1st round. He was throwing hard, so he knows he can go 25 minutes. He knows he's not going to give up, and he did it against one of the best to ever do it at 145 pounds. So there's a lot to build on here for Arnold Allen, man. Lots of respect. A couple of those shots, man, towards the end, some of those that kind of clipped you on the side, doesn't have to be score on the job, man. These are 4-ounce gloves, and anything can happen. When they were throwing down, I was like, oh, wow, man, Max might make a fatal mistake here. But, if anything, Max is a G. He was the one that clipped him at the end and dropped him. But all kinds of respect for Arnold Allen. There's lots to build on.
For sure. And just before we move on, a couple notes here on Max Holloway in terms of what he achieved with this performance here. Joins the 20-win club, the 12th fighter in UFC history to reach 20 octagon wins. He had his 15th UFC performance of at least 100 significant strikes landed. No other fighter in UFC history has 8 such performances. So that goes to show how ridiculous his volume is consistently. First fighter to cross 3,000 significant strikes landed in a UFC career, and has now completed 27 UFC fights without being knocked down, which is also the most in UFC history. So Max Holloway continues to be a legend of the sport, and we saw it once again on Saturday night. But
3,000 significant strikes he's landed, and he's never even been knocked down?
So he's landed 3,122 significant strikes landed. He's absorbed 2,088 and not been knocked down. Obviously, a bit of a concerning number with the latter there, but
wow.
He takes it unlike anyone else. So phenomenal stuff. Dan, were you going to say something? I think you're muted there, Dan.
All right. Is BJ Penn still top 3 as far as never knocked down? Because I remember he had it for a while. Ironic, another Hawaiian has it now.
Yeah, he had the record for the longest time, and then it got broke by Yair Rodriguez, and then Max Holloway took it, and the person behind him is John Jones. So I believe John Jones has like 24 or 25 UFC fights at this point. So that's pretty remarkable. We got some of the all-time greats. But anyways, we got to move on to topic 2, guys, and it is a radical change from what we were just talking about, but it is actually happening. Jake Paul versus Nate Diaz is official for August 5th in Dallas. The pair will meet in an 8-round boxing match contested at 185 pounds. This has been something that's kind of been lingering for a long time, even before Diaz left the UFC. I went back and looked at my first ever interview with Jake Paul before he boxed Ben Askren years ago in the pandemic and all that stuff. And he said, I will be fighting Nate Diaz, Conor McGregor, all these guys in the next few years. You just watch and see what happens. And it's been a bit of a crazy journey, but here we are. It is happening. It has a date and everything. Your guys' reaction to the booking and whether it was the right move to do. Dan, let's start off with you.
You laid it out perfectly, Mike. I don't think anyone can really be surprised from it, whether you've been following it or even more casually following this kind of stuff, which I've definitely been guilty of, right? That being said, of all these type of matchups, if you were going to ask which one would even get a curmudgeon like me excited, this one probably would rank highest on the list. Am I going to be out there with my pennant, my Nate Diaz pennant, and my number one, which would probably be a middle finger sign if it was a Stockton, hand sign for, instead of the baseball game? No, that's not going to be me. That being said, I'm happy for Nate. I hope he gets paid. And hopefully, all of, Jake Paul's improprieties, whether they're, with scamming people, the opposite sex or what have you, don't take him down before Nate can get paid. Obviously, no sympathy for Jake Paul here.
George, your thoughts?
I'm excited for it. I've been wanting to see it for a while. And Nate put himself in a position to go in there and do it, right? But that fight with that he had versus Tony, I believe it'll be almost a year by the time this happens. It just took so slow to get to this point. Jake Paul taking that loss to Tommy Fury kind of kills it a little bit for me, not altogether, because once it's fight night, you down a couple of years and you put a bet on something, you're in, right? But, it's like right now when you're here, it's like, it's not till August. And I know Chael Sonnen did something on this as well, so I don't want to copy him, but I felt exactly the same way he felt. Like, oh, man, like, look at Gilbert Burns saying, hey, in 3 weeks, I'll fight Bilal Muhammad or Kobe Covington. You rub your hands together, you're like, yes, that thing is happening. It's coming up soon. And I know it's another topic, so sorry for using that. But it's in August. It does feel like it's a ways away, and there's so much for me to get excited about before we get to it. So it's like, I saw it. I was like, okay, cool. But, yeah, I wish everything would have moved faster just because Nate was available. It seemed like a ways back. And then Jake Paul taking that loss. It's like, I wanted one of our MMA guys to snatch his soul.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes that's how it goes, right? Like we have the thing that reminded me of what you're saying in terms of an announcement. Like when they announced Jones versus Gone, you're like, hey, this fight is 6 weeks away at this point. But yeah, it feels like it's 4 or 5 months. It's going to be a while, but this is how they're going to promote it, right? They're going to do some press conferences leading up. We're going to see, the fight week build and all that stuff. It's going to be kind of the slower burn between now and then. But I guess goes your thoughts on this booking and whether you think it was the right time to make it.
Yeah, I mean, I think 100% this is the right move for both guys. But Jake had a little bit more of a decision to make here, right? His first loss came at the hands of a legit boxer. We know Jake wants to be taken serious in the boxing world. So if he takes that rematch with Tommy Fury, I don't know that there's enough time to really make the improvements to catch up to Tommy Fury, because at the same time, Tommy Fury's improving as well, right? So I think Jake is still learning. And, if you lose to him a second time, you kind of put a little bit of a nail in that coffin as far as I want to be a pro boxer and the momentum that you can gain from that. Because remember, there are other avenues for him. You see what happened with Floyd Mayweather. Floyd will fight just about anyone, right? So you don't really want to mess too much with that boxing side. So I think what he did was brilliant. Go back to the MMA well, right? That's what got you here. Go after some of these former champions. There's not too many of them left, but the next best thing is probably a guy like Nate Diaz, a guy that brings some heat, right? Help us forget about what happened to you when you fought a legitimate boxer and go back to that MMA well, not just once, but possibly even twice. See a guy like Jorge Masvidal who retired, right? That's another guy that kind of falls along the lines of the type of guys Jake Paul wants to fight. So I think for Nate, good payday. This is what he wanted. This is a matchup that a lot of people are talking about. I think we're going to get excited. It does feel like it's a ways away, but all it takes is a couple press conferences here and there, and we're going to get psyched about this one.
Yeah, and to stick with egos, you mentioned a good payday, which it seems like the two sides, MVP and Nate Diaz's Real Fight Inc., it seems like they're doing like a 50-50 split on all things when it comes to this fight, pay-per-view, concessions, all that stuff that's going to go into it. So hopefully Nate Diaz is going to get the full satisfaction of what he was looking for, the real payday, and hopefully, both these guys bring home a big bag from here. But in terms of the fight itself goes, like, who do you think has more to lose here, right? Like, if Nate Diaz loses this fight, where does it put him? And if Jake Paul loses this fight, what does it do for him? Who do you think has the bigger downside if this one doesn't go their way?
I believe Jake Paul has everything to lose here. Nate doesn't have a title attached to his name the way Silva, Askren, Woodley have, right? What he does have is street credit. And if Jake loses to him, he's going to lose some street credit as well, right? So I think Jake Paul has a lot to lose. That side that we talked about earlier, the boxing side, okay, took a loss there. But now if you take a loss to an MMA guy, a guy that, if we're going to go down the list of all the crisp boxers in MMA, we got to go a while before we get to Nate Diaz. He's more of a volume guy. So I think if Jake Paul suffers a loss there in that scenario, he's going to have more to lose than Nate Diaz. If Nate Diaz loses, he says, well, what do you want from me? I have losses on my record. I'll come back. I'll just do this again. But if Jake Paul loses, I think the train kind of hits a wall.
Do you agree with that, George? I mean, for Nate Diaz, he's supposed to be the badass guy, the Stockton guy who will fight anyone in the UFC, all this stuff, all this reputation. If he loses to the Disney YouTube guy, is that not a bad look for his street cred as well?
Yeah, get ready to hear Andre Ward say, oh my God, when we used to train, that guy was a dog. He's dangerous. Look, against a real pro boxer, no, he's not real dangerous. Luckily for him, Jake Paul's not that. He's just a celebrity, YouTuber, influencer, whatever you want to call it, who does have some skills, him and his brother, respect. But Nate has this trilogy match versus Nate that awaits him. After this big old bag of money, there's another bag of money ready for him. And it doesn't matter that the guys are taking losses. They're superstars. They get to settle it. 209 crowd versus the Irish crowd. Who's not going to dig that? So he's got options. Jake Paul has options, but outside of boxing are where those options lies. Going back to being an influencer or the businesses that he's created, the promotions that he wants to do. I think the train does start to derail because now he finally faced a boxer, took an L, and he finally faces an MMA fighter that is more from the striking oriented, even though I guess he originally started from jiu-jitsu, to be fair to Askren and Woodley. Their first talents were wrestling, and then they picked up some hands. Well, Woodley did. And Nate, Nate, obviously he trained at it. He was a volume guy and everything. But let's not forget, Nate gets dropped a lot too. So I don't think this is a slam dunk for either side. It's good. Who's going to have their cardio? Cardio's decided a lot of fights in the Jake Paul era. And who's going to have the cardio and who really puts in a good camp and doesn't just go and collect the bag? That's who's going to win this fight.
Dan, any kind of different opinions there on who has more to lose between these two?
Yeah, I love the Andre Ward shout by George, the brace yourself meme almost, right? Because that talk's going to get dusted off again. Here's the thing, though. Obviously, I agree with the guys, especially with what Go said as far as, aside here, Paul has more to lose than Diaz. But let me tell you why that's an unfair question, no matter who it is, when you're talking about not just Nate, but the Diaz brothers. Say what you will about Khabib's undefeated record. You mentioned Mayweather in this sort of spot, whether it's in their irrespective sports or these kind of mix-ups that we're talking about now, guys. Nate has an edge even over guys like Khabib and Mayweather will never have. And what is that? Well, Khabib and Mayweather and most fighters depend on winning, right? Not the Diaz brothers. In fact, whether we're talking about Nick Diaz laying down Anderson Silva, throwing middle fingers at UFC 58 before walking out to face Sean Shirk, Nate Diaz, whether it's, getting the late round surge, or maybe when he's not getting a late round surge, they could have their bloods covered with face and all they have to do is this in the fifth round. What? You don't want to fight me? What? We've seen it before. Hashtag everybody's on steroids. Listen, it doesn't matter the part of the fight it's at. The Diaz brothers always have an out. They don't need to win. In fact, you could argue they have gained more popularity and losses than wins. Obviously, Conor, Nate won, notwithstanding. But yeah, Nate has nothing to lose here. Nothing to lose at all.
I don't know. I get what you guys are saying, but part of me, like, it feels like this is different, right? It's one thing to lose to the most badass, high-level, high-ranked MMA fighters in the world, who we all know how good they are. It's another thing to lose a boxing match to a guy who's only been doing it in a few years and is mostly known as the Disney YouTube guy to a lot of people, influencer dude. So I don't know. It's going to be really interesting. But to stick with Nate in terms of what happens after this, when they put out the press release announcing this fight, his quote, and I quote here, was saying, besides Canelo, he's the biggest thing in boxing, referencing Jake Paul. I'm here to conquer that. I'm the king of combat sports, and then I'm headed back to the UFC to get my belts, et cetera, et cetera. So he's kind of indicating that he just wants to grab this bag and then head back to the UFC. Dana White essentially asked about this quote at the post-fight press conference on Saturday in Kansas City. And he basically said, wait and see. We'll see what happens. Wouldn't really give any thoughts on this fight between Diaz and Paul. Said, I hope they make money. But when asked about Nate's comments about coming back, he was like, hey, we'll see what happens. And that's a little bit of a change in tone from a few months ago when he said, this is Nate Diaz's house. He runs his house. Anytime he wants to be here, he'll be welcome back. So the narrative, I guess, is shifting a little bit. I don't know. What do you think here? Like, is Nate going to be back in the UFC? Does it completely depend on the outcome here? How do you think that unfolds after this boxing match happens?
I think all signs point to probably won't be back. I mean, when you look at Nate, he's not the most active guy, right? He's going to make millions of dollars in this boxing fight. And then what do you see him doing? Putting it in the bank, investing it, 401k. Like, dude's going to want to spend that money. He's going to want to go away. That's kind of like the Diaz recipe. They go away for a while. They spend some money. When they go through it, they want to come back and fight. But he's just getting older. And I can't remember if it was Dan or George, but they referenced his last fight. Like, he just looked a lot slower, less interested, right? And really the golden goose back home in the UFC is Conor McGregor. And we have to see in which direction that goes. Because right now, guys, the longer and longer we wait for that fight, the less and less interested I am in it. I really don't care at this point. And I think the UFC, if Nate Diaz is making all this money boxing, you think they're going to match something like that? Like, is Nate really going to be fired up to take less money to fight in the UFC? All signs to me point he's not coming back.
George, what do you think?
I think he'll be back. I think despite what Dana says, I think Dana likes to send little messages every time he talks. Some of that might have been towards that anger he still has because Francis Ngannou played the same card. You notice Francis Ngannou didn't get well wishes on the way out. Nate did. But Nate originally had Khamzat Chimaev, let's not forget. So that was going to be a rude way to exit the UFC. Things shifted. It worked out with Tony Ferguson, 2 OGs. Everyone was on their feet. But, I don't know. He'll be welcome back because it's a huge, huge fight for the UFC for them to have it, despite the fact that they're not coming in on winning streaks, so there won't be a title on the line. It'll just be massive. And these guys, they'll probably build it up with press conferences, throwing bottles or whatever. It's just that side of MMA that a lot of us like to see, whether there's a belt or not. We like to see two people that dislike each other mix it up. And I do want to be clear about Jake Paul. I did say that boxing would be kind of like, it'd be the end road for him because he lost to a boxer. He lost to a more striking-oriented MMA. But this guy's made a ton of money. So, yes, he gets the final laugh. This guy is worth a lot of money and still has tons to go on. And he had his run and he had a lot of fun and he took over boxing kind of for the past 2-3 years. He can always look back on that, So it's not like a complete fail. It'll just be the end.
Oh, make no mistake about it. This is just a, side quest almost for Jake Paul in this life. Like, he'll try to do a tattoo bet with Nate Diaz at the press conference or something. And if he loses, of course, he's going to try to win, but he will gladly get that tattoo. And then he can tell his kids and grandkids, I got this because I lost to Nate Diaz. And it'll just be a funny anecdote to him as opposed to a devastating, negative moment in his life or something like that. So this is all gravy for Jake Paul. Just the fact that it is even happening is pretty unbelievable. I'll close this topic out with you, Dan. Do you think we see Nate back in the UFC after this? Is it dependent on the result? If he loses, is that door going to be closed? If he wins, is that even more wide open because Dana White will be like, thank you for doing this and being the MMA guy who beats him? What do you make of this?
I'm still going to stick to my guns and think that the Diaz brothers just know how to evolve and make money off losses more than anybody else. And on the other side of that equation, even if it is a loss, why I could still see it is because I could still see, despite the not well wishes for Ngannou that Gigi mentioned, I could still see the UFC and Dana taking Ngannou back. And if I can see them taking Ngannou back, I could see them taking Diaz back. And why would you think they would take them back, Dan? Well, because as much of a power move as it is, that Dana White has no issue flexing, saying, you can go. We know that we have the grass is greener. Well, if he wanted to stick with that logic, and even if he wanted to add in his kind of usual pettiness, I feel like it's almost an insult to say, look who came crawling back. Like, are you going to tell me Dana White's ego is going to be hurt if they come, quote unquote, crawling back? Even if they don't, that's how he's going to see it. That's how he's going to spin it. So do not be surprised to see not just Nate, but even Ngannou back at a certain point with the way things going.
Yeah, we'll see what happens there. The Ngannou thing is a whole other can of worms. George, you're going to say something?
I just want to say real quick, I know we got to move on. I do agree with Dan. He will be back. Ngannou will be back at some point. It's just too much money. And, yeah, there's always a spin to everything for Dana White. He's not worried about it.
Man, if I had to put my money on one, I think I'd pick Nate over Francis at this
Sure.
point, but I guess we'll see what happens. But
yeah.
Anyways, we will have months and months and months to talk about this fight. I'm sure there will be many twists and turns leading up to August 5th. But for now, we have to move on to topic 3, and this involves Alex Pereira. The former UFC middleweight champion officially pulled the trigger on a move to 205, announcing his plans for the future on his YouTube channel this past week. Is this the correct decision for his career at this point? And who should he make his divisional debut against, guys? Taking into account that Dana White said on Saturday that it will not be a title shot against Jamal Hill, kind of putting together a bow on that Glover Teixeira circle there that we saw when Hill won the belt, and he'll have to face a, quote, real guy before he is considered for a title shot. So, George, if you are the UFC matchmakers, Mick Maynard, how do you handle Alex Pereira at 205 for his divisional debut?
Mm-hmm. I would probably, I think Alexander Rakic should be coming back right about now. And I would like to see him against somebody like Alexander Rakic or Yuri Prochazka. It's just that I think Yuri Prochazka probably is closer to the front of the line of fighting for the title. So that, and I just took one of the two from the guys. Sorry, guys. So I'll stick with Alexander Rakic. I think that would be an excellent fight for both guys. I do like Pereira's move up because he's not letting the UFC or Israel dictate his next move. He's kind of making his next move. And remember, he can always come back. In fact, he said it on his YouTube channel, 185, not a problem. Was he one of the last to weigh in? Yeah, but he still made it. So he says it won't be a problem. He'll still be able to get back to 185 and at least have a hand in dictating the terms. Because think about it. This guy's got to have an ego too, man. They're 1-1. They both knocked each other out, except he has that history in kickboxing. So even though he didn't get the last dub, he's still, like I say, has a little bit of pride in the fact that in that Izzy Pereira series, he's kind of up on the guy. So right now he's going to try and maybe get another title. Maybe that'll be his way of saying, hey, look what I did with, and Izzy couldn't. And again, I'm not trying to rub salt in Izzy's wounds. That dude's a stud. I'm just saying, I'm trying to get myself into the head of Poatan and maybe what he's thinking. Who knows? Because look, they come out here on their YouTube channel and they say the right things, but in the gym they're saying, yeah, I'm going to clown him. I'm going to fuck him up. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. That's the way fighters are. They present themselves in a different way, save for a few of those gangsters like the Diaz brothers and a few others. But I think that's what Potang is kind of feeling right now.
And folks in the comments, if you have any suggestions for who you'd like to see Alex Pereira fight at 205, make sure to drop them in and maybe we'll give it a shout if you come up with a good idea. But next up to Goes, I mean, what do you think? Do you like this Alexander Rakic suggestion by your bro here, or do you think there's a better option for his debut?
Yeah, it's not bad. I mean, there's definitely more options, in my opinion, to get him going at 205 than there are at 185. So I kind of like Johnny Walker. I think that's a guy that's going to stand in front of him and want to test himself. They're going to stand and bang. But really, after a while, like, how many of these guys are going to just sit there and stand and trade with the guy before they resort to some wrestling, which is what we feel like was waiting for him at 185, right? You got these guys up at 205 that are going to want to implement that same game plan. So whoever it is, we got to hope that Alex Pereira makes the adjustments that he needs to be able to contend with some of these guys. But I feel like a guy like Johnny Walker, it would be an interesting fight. I think it would be a fun fight. And I think it does give Alexander Pereira a little bit more of an advantage as far as a guy that's going to want to really go toe to toe with you for a while and give you those moments where you can maybe get that knockout.
Yeah, and Me Diamond 44 in the comments suggests Alex Pereira versus Jan Blachowicz, which could be an interesting one. But what's going to happen with Jan Blachowicz? He teased after the title fight, maybe he wants to go down to 185 and have a rematch with Israel Adesanya there. I don't know if it's possible for this man to make 185. He's 40 years old and has never done it before, and he's pretty damn chiseled as it is as a light heavyweight. So I don't know if that was just, in jest, but if he does do that, I think that creates an interesting situation for Adesanya, but we will get to him in a moment. Dan Tom, what do you think of these ideas? And I want to ask you as well, how do you think Pereira's skill set fits in at 205? I mean, was the whole debate about him, right? Like against anyone but Adesanya at middleweight, how would he do against the Vittoris, the Whitakers, and stuff like that? Do you think some of these 205 contenders are a better fit for his skill set? Is he even going to be able to beat one of these real guys, as Dana says, to get a title shot there?
I think he can. Simply put, is that there's less wrestlers at 205 and at heavyweight. I think 205 and even heavyweight, Alex Pereira would do much better than he did at middleweight, where he actually got the title. I know there was some kind matchmaking there, and that's ultimately what we have to have a question answered as far as Pereira's wrestling. Blachowicz would answer that, but I don't like that. I like the Rakic and Walker ideas. Those were going to be mine. What else was going to be mine was going to be Dustin Jacoby if he won this past week. Unfortunately, he did not, and I wasn't really having my hopes banked on that because I actually picked against him this last weekend. But, there was a little bit of history there. That would have been a classic UFC matchmaking route. But I've went on the record of saying this before. I've got a ton of respect for Jamal Hill, despite picking against him in his last fight. I have even more respect after seeing his ground and pound and the potential there. But even with that being said, I still felt like his hardest matchups, and people gave me a lot of crap for this, was Jan Blachowicz and potentially Alex Pereira, who, when I said this at the time, had no intentions of moving up. He was still the middleweight champion. Not only is there a revenge plot there that the UFC could also build off of, avenging your former master. You could go up to 205, avenge all of Glover's losses. But the left hook in particular, left-sided shots have really marked up Jamal Hill, even in his victories. Even when he iced OSP to when he won the title against Teixeira, left hooks. And who has the most dangerous left hook in any division? That is Poatan Pereira, who has an underrated left hook that was able to beat Adesanya. Well, that's Jan Blachowicz. So those two guys are the top threats. So I don't want to see Jan Blachowicz move down for that reason. And I don't want to see, yet again, two of my favorite contenders, two of the arguable best contenders for a division, having to face each other. So do not do Blachowicz versus Pereira. I would probably see a Volkan Ozdemir versus Pereira if you're going to make me guess.
Scott Ryan in the comments says, let Paul Craig turn him into a pretzel. And that's on the 30-year anniversary of the UFC. That's probably as old school style versus style as you could possibly get. Alex Pereira versus Paul Craig. So maybe Nick Maynard feels like doing something funky and going down that road, but we'll see. But kind of the repercussions of this move up, and Pereira didn't completely close the door on 185, but I want to ask you, given this move, given Adesanya's more or less dismissal, saying if Pereira was going to stay at 185, he needs to go do the hard road work and stuff. Are you worried we might never get this MMA trilogy between these two now, between Pereira and Israel Adesanya?
Yeah, man, I don't think it's going to happen. Like I said, I mean, in both divisions, there just seems to be a little bit of kryptonite there waiting for Alex Pereira. We'd have to see how much better he gets from fight to fight. But we're asking him to make strides in one of the most difficult areas in mixed martial arts. So to see that happen another time, I mean, unless it happens in slap fight or something like that, I don't think it's going to happen in MMA.
Yeah, what do you think, George?
Well, I think they will, because it's too big of a fight for it not to happen. And, somebody in the chat threw out a comment. I can't find it right now, but somebody said, here it is. C3 says, how about the Izzy rematch at 205? Well, I suppose if we're giving Pereira the fast track, and he does fight a Rakic, who injured his knee about a year ago. That's why I said I think he might be, getting ready to come back. Well, he's going to be kind of like one or two fights away from a title shot, and that would be pretty gangster of Izzy to come up to fight him to try and get a second belt and to settle the MMA trilogy. So there's a possibility there. There's a possibility of Paul Craig does pretzel up Pereira, if that fight were to happen, and Pereira goes, man, maybe I don't want a part of this. Izzy's gone down and had a few fights and cleaned the division up. Let's just get this trilogy out of the way. I just think there's just so many possibilities where it can happen. Therefore, I think it will happen. And by the way, Paul Craig turned Jamal Hill into a pretzel, if you recall, and then he goes and wins 4 more and becomes world champion. So that reality check, a wrestler beating you up or a jiu-jitsu guy putting you into a pretzel, sometimes it's also good for you because guess what? You address that hole, and the next thing you know, you can stop it from happening again, and you become better. So I'm not totally against that either. Although Hill's 31, I think Shaheda's a few years older, so that was at least earlier in his career.
Yeah, and as FaZe says in the comments here, Potan has a difficult road ahead now. No matter what division he's in, it's going to be tricky here. The Israel Adesanya stuff, his backstory led him to these title shots, but now it's time to find out, what the real deal is in terms of his actual skill. And just to close out this topic with you, Dan, given all this, we are not going to get the Adesanya fight right now, it seems. So what do you do with Izzy? Dana White said on Saturday at the press conference that pretty much days after his win, he's been hitting up the UFC brass saying he wants to get back in there. He teased it could be before the end of the summer. So what do you think the next 185 title fight should be if they're not doing Adesanya versus Pereira 3?
Man, that is a left turn question. If Izzy's wanting to stay busy, I'm not sure if he's wanting to stay busy up a division or not. But down a division, he's actually got, the garden is getting watered as far as contenders. You've got Khamzat Chimaev, of course, is a big name. Obviously, Adesanya probably would want him to, and the Gen Pop would want him to, establish himself a little more before getting that, a title shot at 185. You've got Bo Nickel, speaking of wrestlers. So you have these guys that maybe are not the greatest stylistic matchups once those blossoms bloom. But the problem is they're still in the blossom stage, right? Let's be honest here. They have a ton of potential, but I don't know who's actually going to be right there. So I got thrown off guard. I was prepared to answer Poatan Pereira, who has just been getting mislabeled as a bully for his style and for going down to 185. But yeah, I don't think they're going to fight again. That's for sure. I think both Izzy and the UFC are trying to memory hole, even though it's 1-3 in the series, with Poatan being clearly ahead. Between the Arrow celebration to how it's kind of getting memory hold, they're just going to act like, Izzy won the whole series, and we probably won't see it again unless that 205 scenario happens that George beautifully laid out. But yeah, it's going to be slim pickings for Adesanya at 185 right now.
Yeah, pretty much the only people in the top 10 he has not fought yet that would be any way logical would be Dricus du Plessis and Sean Strickland, both of whom would have some pretty dark lead-ups, I think, for a variety of different reasons. But anyways, we need to move on here. Let's go to topic 4, guys. It involves UFC 288. Charles Oliveira is out of the co-main event against Beneil Dariush due to injury, and it sounds like it's going to be rescheduled for UFC 289 on June 10th. At least that's what Beneil Dariush told the Schmo he's being approached about. We haven't heard anything from Oliveira in regard to this, but it sounds like it's not going to be a replacement opponent for Dariush in a couple weeks here. They just want to move the fight altogether, and it's just a matter of what new date it is going to land on. But is that the right way to play it for this lightweight division? I know there was a lot of resistance to this matchup from the beginning. Beneil Dariush supporters saying he should have just got the title shot right away, all that kind of stuff. So Goes, I want to ask you, is it the right call to just push this one back altogether? I guess it's only going to be like a month. It's not the worst thing in the world. It'd be different if it was 6. But even then, if you're Dariush, do you say, no, man, just give me Oliveira or give me Islam Makhachev?
It's only a month away, so I can see why they're doing that and why he would accept. But if it were me personally, I think that might be the moment to put your foot down. Enough is enough. It's a great streak that he's got. He probably deserved it before any of this was even talked about. Look at a guy like Arnold Allen, right? What do you have, like 10 straight in the UFC? Look where he's at today, right? Now he's got to go back to the drawing board. I think Beneil Dariush has played ball at the UFC quite a few times. If it were me, I probably would have put my foot down and said, look, just give me the damn shot already. But it's only a month away, and it's something I guess we're just going to have to wait out. The card, though, man, that hurts.
Yeah, so we'll get to that in a moment. Dan, what do you think? Do you think Dariush kind of, he did say, I guess, to the Schmo that he had two qualifications. He said he needed a bigger payday to push this back, and he needed assurances that if the fight does fall apart again, via Charles Oliveira's doing, that he would absolutely be guaranteed to get that shot. So do you think, I guess, given the circumstances, he played this right?
About played is about as right as you can, right? I mean, I like those details. Thank you for adding that context. And Mike, I think that's really important. And more fighters should be taking note and taking advantage of those opportunities anytime they can. I'm just going to call it the elephant in the room. And I'll tell you why I hate this matchup. I love Canadians. So I think it's great for you guys because you guys need something else on that card. I'm not hating on that at all. I get that move. But let's be honest. What's the elephant in the room here, folks? It's marketable fighters, like we see it mostly at these divisions that Dariush competes in at lightweight, where the same four guys fight each other over and over again. And I'm a big fan of the boxing four kings, but let's take it easy, folks. Let's have a little bit of rotation, shall we? And let's be honest, we see this happen all the time, because if there's marketable fighters, well, what else does that mean? That means there's air quotes non-marketable fighters, at least to the UFC brass's eyes. And how do they do that? Well, they make them fight each other. And, not to bring a country thing or any kind of bias into that, but I can't help but notice, folks, that it's always the Brazilians, and not just, picking on North American promotions. Russian promotions do this too. They bring in the Brazilians to fight the guys that nobody wants to, because Brazil, pat yourself on the back. Y'all are a bunch of warriors. Trying to throw a positive stereotype your way, if you'll allow me, and my 3% Portuguese self-speaking here. But yes, I am tired of seeing the Brazilian fighters, men or women, no matter the division, always being stuck, having to toe the company line, keep things busy, fight people that no one wants to fight, including each other. I hate it. I see what you're doing, UFC. You're not fooling me. You can put rankings and you can talk about how this makes sense. It makes no sense. Let's replay Gray Maynard, after the draw with Frankie Edgar, where they were about to move on. Dana was like, we're going to give it to Pettis. And then he saw Maynard there, and it tugged at Dana's heartstrings, when he still had some back then. And what did Dana do? He did the Dana thing that we liked Dana doing. He said, you know what? I'm going to step in here, and we're going to do the right thing. I wish he would do that here and just give it to Dariush. He deserves it, man. He deserves it.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, if you talk to Beneil, which I know the guys from Junkie Radio did here pretty much right when this fight was originally coming out, he loves the idea of fighting Charles Oliveira. He wants to fight Charles Oliveira. The circumstances around it just suck. He should be getting the title shot instead. But George, just to fast forward a little bit through here, I know you didn't get your take on this injury, but I want to ask you about what comes next. UFC 288 is hurting right now. And Dana White said at the press conference on Saturday, another note from him, that they are working on something new for this May 6th card, which is pretty lackluster outside of the main event between Aljamain Sterling and Henry Cejudo right now. Teased that it could potentially involve Gilbert Burns. Gilbert Burns out there on Twitter saying, I'm just waiting for the phone call. Hopefully it's a top 5 guy. Absolute savage Gilbert Burns. If he does fight, it would be his 3rd fight 5 months into 2023, which is just ridiculous. But it's idea time, guys. George, if you are in that room, the UFC headquarters, the war room here on Monday, as Dana says, they're going to come out something today. Maybe it's happening right now as we're recording the show. Let us know in the comments if something breaks. But what's your new UFC 288 co-main event? How do you save this card?
Okay, so I believe Bilal Muhammad is the most qualified to fight Leon Edwards, for starters. But we all know Colby Covington was the one that was anointed next. So just to throw that out. Bilal Muhammad has been retweeting that he would fight at UFC 288 in 3 weeks, except he was retweeting a lot of stuff that involved Colby Covington. But he did sound like he's ready to go. So if he's ready to go for Covington, I'm sure he'd be ready to go for Burns. Now, Burns has already said, hey, I'm in. He's blowing up Dana's cell phone, right? So he's in. Bilal Muhammad sounds like he's in. However, didn't Colby Covington tell us, all you got to do is call us and call me and I'll be there in 24 hours or in a week or in 2 weeks or whatever. He's ready to go. So it sounds like we got 3 dogs that'll fight on super late notice. Let's get 2 of those 3 in there. Now, who would I like those 2 of those 3 to be? I guess at this point, man, I love you, Gilbert Burns, but you just fought. I'd rather see the 2 guys that haven't fought fight, and then the winner obviously gets Leon Edwards, and then Gilbert Burns can be the substitute or whatever for that fight with the promise of getting the winner. Because to be fair, he has already gotten the title shot, and he has recently fought. And I think he just needs to relax, man. When you take some time off and work on your skills, you come back and you do great. So it's no shade at Burns at all. But he says he's ready to go, and if one of the other 2 isn't, he'll be one of the 2 that's ready to go. I think that that's a nice way to plug something in for the loss that we took off Dariush and Oliveira. And if you give me 6 seconds, for the love of God, just give Dariush a shot at Makhachev. Start building it now. Send him to Abu Dhabi. Start doing the press conference. That's your fight.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think that latter part's going to happen, but we'll see what happens with Beneil or Bilal and Gilbert. If they do make that fight, the welterweight conversation is going to get very, very interesting, because if you doubt Colby Covington's resume compared to some of these other guys now, if Burns beats Bilal or Bilal beats Burns, then they both have a infinitely better resume, and then the whole thing, changes once again. But we need to move on since we are running short on time here, and we still need to hit topic 5, guys. We rolling on to, once again, another big UFC event this weekend. After a few weeks on the road, the UFC returns to the Apex down there in Las Vegas for UFC Fight Night 222, where you guys are at, featuring Sergey Pavlovich versus Curtis Blades in the main event. Break down this matchup for me, guys. Is it as simple as Pavlovich needs to keep it standing and unload those ridiculous bombs, and Blades needs to get takedown success to win? Dan, Tom, we have our fight analyst here, so we will go to you first. Break this one down for us. Give us an early insight on the official Dan Tom Fight Week breakdown.
Yeah, you're going to have to go to MMAJunkie.com later in the week to get it. Of course, I have a harder time firing from the hip earlier in the week because I actually have to do videos, explanations, and 3 different phases explaining and showing my work. Not that it matters, because as you can see with my ever cold streak on gambling, analysis means nothing, but it is my job. And right now you've got Blades as your favorite, as he should be. He's the more proven product in 5 rounds at heavyweight. He also has a very dominant skill set that I just said you don't see at heavyweight, which is wrestling. And what is the fighting surface? Well, I believe we'll be back in the Apex, I believe, this week. I'm spinning around. I'm in Vegas right now, going to Hawaii. I don't know where I'm at, but if it is in that small cage, you bet your buttons that Blades deserves to be that favorite. Money coming in on Pavlovich now. He is a live dog always. He is pretty much a human refrigerator. The only time I picked against Pavlovich was against Overeem, which was correct. So I'm really good at picking Pavlovich fights. Right now, I'm probably leaning toward Blades. But if you see a Pavlovich prediction on my breakdown at MMAJunkie.com this week, it's probably for a good reason.
Yeah, I mean, that guy has absurd power. So if you're not giving him any chance to knock out Curtis Blades, who we have seen be knocked out before, I think you're probably analyzing it wrong. And I don't want to put George or Goes in a position to have to go head-to-head here with Dan Tom on the X's and O's. So I will just roll on to kind of a different element of this. George, I want to ask you, what does this fight really mean for the heavyweight division here? Because it's interesting, right? Like, on paper, this is number 1 contender type material, but it sounds like, according to, once again, Dana White on Saturday at the press conference, saying that John Jones versus Stipe Miocic is now going to be targeted for November in New York, as opposed to July during International Fight Week. So does that mean the winner of Pavlovich versus Blades is not just looking at maybe 1 more fight after this, maybe even 2?
Which is weird because, I was going to say Stipe Miocic earned that because he was the backup fighter for Jones and Ghana. We all know the backup fighter is automatically next. Nope, that was Pavlovich. But anyway, putting that to the side, yes, the winner of this fight has a lot going on, right? And I think the winner of this fight should just wait out in this fight that's happening in November. Why they keep backing it up, I don't know, but they should wait that out because I think they both have done enough. Blades is on an incredible streak with the exception of that 1 loss that he took to, I believe it was Lewis. But for the most part, he has been a beast. And then Pavlovich is riding 5 straight, all finishes. So they've done enough. Why go out there and risk it? Now, yes, I know Dana White will go, when that happens, things don't go your way. Yeah, I suppose. But sometimes you also fight and lose. And guess what? You just ruined the title shot too. So I think at this point, both guys could just benefit from the win and then waiting out the winner of that other fight, or maybe being in a position to step in because, as you've seen, it's been postponed over and over. That's for a reason, and a lot of it has to do with Miocic, man. That guy just can't seem to stay healthy.
Yeah, and I know it's almost the joke of the MMA community now, the backup thing, but is that like almost the best move here goes for the winner of this to be like, get on the mic and be like, hey, make me the backup for the title fight, because that almost gives me the winner of the next shot, even though that's quite a ways away. It would be a long wait.
Yeah, and then the thing is, this fight keeps getting postponed so many times that, how many times are you going to be weighing in as a backup, right? Now, granted, at heavyweight, you don't have them big cuts or nothing like that, but you still got to be prepared. You still got to be ready. But it's going to be an interesting fight, man. And I think the ball's in Blades' court. I think as long as he shoots early, puts that in the back of Pavlovich's mind that he can do that, smaller cage. He should be good here, and I think he has the resume.
Yeah, it's going to be very interesting to see how this whole thing unfolds, because heavyweights obviously has John Jones at the top, but I think that makes it trickier for all the other contenders at this point. But a big time fight for this heavyweight division, no doubt, going down on Saturday. And before we get out of here, we have a couple additional questions. Cold coffee in the back. I'm going to do something a little different here since we're short on time. I'm just going to throw one of these additionals to each of these guys and get their response to that, and then we can get out of here for this week. So I want to start with you goes on Saturday at UFC on ESPN 44. Clay Guida gave us a nice post-retirement fake out in the post-fight interview with Daniel Cormier. He takes his gloves off during the decision announcement. DC kind of sees him there and approaches him for an interview where he sounds for a second like he's going to retire, and then ends up, I think, wishing his mom happy birthday and shouts out like a 10-year-old kid that he knew in the crowd, something like that. Dana White did not like this. He was very pissed, quote, in his words, and kind of raked Guido over the coals a little bit for doing this as they're trying to run a live event. I guess just give me your take on this. Do you think Guido is out of pocket here for doing this, or did Dana overreact to the whole situation?
I think a little bit of both. I mean, it's a foul for Clay Guida for sure. But if anybody really has a longer leash, I mean, a guy that's spilled so much blood, sweat, and tears, I got to imagine it's Clay Guida. So I think, liken this to when we were kids, if he went to the principal's office, I think Dana hits him with the, "You rascal, don't you ever do that again. Now go out there and tell everybody else I was hard on you." Leave it at that. It's not the biggest thing in the world.
Fair play. And to you, Dan Tom, since you are about to head out to Hawaii for Bellator, we have a double header coming up this weekend. Bellator 294, Bellator 295, a couple championship fights, a Grand Prix final, a fair bit of meat on the bone on these two cards. So as you head out there, as you wait to sit and get on this flight, what is your biggest excitement? What are you looking forward to seeing on Friday or Saturday, whether it's a particular fighter or fight? Give us a little Bellator doubleheader mini preview here.
Man, obviously Stotts and Mix is probably the number one on the list. It is what they're choosing to headline their Saturday show. Of course, they're going to have Carmouche as usual. She is the champion and with a strong military background. They got other fighters like Tim Johnson with military backgrounds on that Friday show. But on Saturday's show, also on the prelims. Now, Bellator has been doing well with their roster to where they are also having the same problem as the UFC, where they have some of their bigger names on the prelims. But as far as I don't know how, giant of a name, but he's a big name to me because he's a fun fighter. Mads Burnell versus Justin Gonzalez. That's a low-key banger. Justin Gonzalez is an action fighter as well. So I think that's a really fun matchup. They also got other guys like Kai Kamaka, some big wrestlers, big wrestling names as well, kind of on the prelims. So I will warn everybody, solid top offering billings, but don't forget about the prelims for Bellator as well.
Yeah, lots of MMA coming up this weekend, and we will have yourself and Matt Erickson out on site there in Hawaii for a couple big cards, and we will close it out with you, George, as we switch gears to another promotion. This past weekend, we saw Shane Burgos lose his PFL debut to Olivier Aubin-Mercier at 2023 PFL 3 to become the latest UFC veteran to slip up in his PFL debut. At this point, a few years in, as we've seen more and more crossover between these fighters, is this becoming a trend here where UFC fighters are struggling in the PFL? Are they being given maybe too much credit about their chances joining into this organization? How do you think this whole thing is kind of unfolding? What's your take on it as we see another UFC notable expect to make a big splash over in PFL stumble in their debut?
All right, Dan, I wouldn't hate you if you bring back some of them donuts that Matt Erickson's been talking about. Yes, lots to unpack here, but I'll do it really fast. I think Burgos would have lost to OAM if they were both still in the UFC. It's just a difficult matchup for him. And OAM is somebody that came over from the UFC and has won a title. So it's not a complete these guys are coming over and just getting dusted. Now, a few have, like Rory. He had some wins, but mostly to the tail end, he just didn't. And I think that's the key there. Tail end, him, Pettis, Fabricio Verdum, a few of those guys, it just wasn't their prime. Now, that said, this is MMA and anything can happen. That's why the WEC guys, when they used to get compared to the UFC guys, if they come over to the UFC, they'll get walloped. Van Henderson won a title. He did well. Anthony Pettis won a title. He did well. And Jamie Warner and a few of the other guys, Shane Roller, they held their own. Anthony Njokuani. Same thing with the Strikeforce guys coming over. So Michael Chandler, he's come over and he's gotten some dubs. So No, don't worry about the UFC houses most of the great fighters, but not all of them. But it's MMA, anything can happen. A lot of it has to do with the matchup. So, I think Burgos will be fine. He was moving up to 55, but he was fighting a big 55er who sticks to his game plan and has experience. So, I don't see too much into it. Now, if a prime UFC guy was coming over, which you could argue Burgos was, remember, came over as a featherweight, coming over now as a lightweight. Then let's say Burgos were to lose his next one and maybe even another fight down the road, then you'd go, oh, wow, what's going on here, right? But I think in the case of the first 3 or 4 that have come over, they've just kind of, they're in their latter stages. Thiago Santos, same thing, the latter stages. And PFL, Bellator, they all house some really solid fighters that can tune you up, man.
Yeah, you missed the shout out to Bellator veteran Gaston Bolanos, who got the big win in his UFC debut over the weekend. Come on, man. But no, I think you make good points here. Obviously, Shane Burgos must be noted that he typically fights at 145, and Olivier Aubin-Mercier is, a career-long lightweight, so that made it, I'm sure, trickier for him as well. But we will see what happens. The good thing about PFL, I guess, is Burgos will be able to get in there in a few weeks again and try to turn it around, and he still has a chance to do something in their season format over there. But nevertheless, that does it for this week's Spitting Back Clique. Obviously, a lot to unpack on this past week's episode, and I'm sure it will be no different next week when we are back here. Same time, same place. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in, and we'll see you back here next week.